All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to webinar number 3, A Healthy Store Mental Health, Facts and Figures of Mental Health. For those of you that do not know me, my name is Sunny Broad. I'm the Vice President of Member Relations and Education. And before I get to introduce our amazing guest today, let's just go over our agenda. So today we will be talking about the reality of mental health, the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety, Psychological Health and Safety, and accommodations. Also, like all of our webinars, this is available in webinar audio. So, if you are having trouble hearing the webinar, you can log in by using the following details. Our call-in toll-free number is 1-844-426-4405, which is both applicable in U.S. and Canada. You will be asked to type in a code. Your access code is 644-671-321 pound or hashtag. Also, as all of our webinars, this webinar is being recorded. All attendees on our webinar today will receive a web link to access this webinar recording by email, and also this webinar is available on the Retail Council of Canada's website. Lastly, submit your questions for the members on this webinar. We highly encourage this. You should see a feature on the right-hand bottom of your screen saying WebEx question and answer. Please feel free to type in the questions during the webinar, and do note that we don't get to the questions until the end of the presentation. Also want to let everyone know that our last webinar will be coming up on November 12th, A Healthy Store, Workplace Accommodations and Resources for Mental Health. So again, that's November 12th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and I will be joined by our guest speaker, Bev Kobe, who is from Goodwill Industries, Ontario Great Lakes. And just to let everyone know on our call today, we were actually at Goodwill Industries. I had the privilege to be joined by Parliament Assistant PA, Daisy Y, who works for the Ministry for Seniors and Accessibility, and with Minister Cho. We had a great press release last Friday in Kitchener at Goodwill, and we really reiterated the importance of ensuring that we respect persons with accessibility and our seniors, and it was a great press release. For anyone that follows RCC on social media or LinkedIn, please feel free to check our post as we explain this in a little bit more detail. All right, well, let's get into our session. I am very glad today to introduce our guest today, Mr. Lawrence D. Blake. Now, Lawrence is a certified psychological health and safety advisor and a program manager for Mental Health Works. Thank you for joining us today, Lawrence.
Yeah, no problem. Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. Well, with that said, I'm going to pass it to you, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, so today we're just going to be discussing some very high level, what I like to call a big hand, little map, facts and figures in regards to mental health in the workplace. We'll talk a wee bit about the national standard and what psychological health and safety means, then finalize with just a brief conversation about the accommodations. When I think of mental health in the workplace, what I think about is the challenge that's immediately presented to us as leaders and coworkers. And really that challenge is this a performance issue or is this a mental health concern? When someone is experiencing a mental illness or potentially experiencing an addictions concern, we notice things like lack of concentration, absenteeism, presenteeism in the workplace, difficulty hitting key deliverables or KPI. And this is further compounded by the fact that only 36% of us, and I think most of us are going to be included in this figure, would actually feel comfortable going to our boss.
Right.
So in my case, the CEO, and saying I have a concern, that I need some time off, or that I need some support in the workplace. And so it's important for us to remember back to when we might have been a worker or an employee, or maybe not having direct reports and instead reporting to someone, what some of the challenges that we faced were. Because that empathy that's formed in that historical reflection really does equip us and prepare us for good works in the workplace moving forward.
Right. Excellent.
The reality, just to address the scope of this, is that 1 in 5 will experience a mental health concern each year. And when we say experience a mental health concern, what we're really talking about is breaching that clinical threshold for diagnosis. It doesn't mean that we will be diagnosed with something like depression or anxiety, but it means that we're experiencing the symptoms associated with those health concerns. And then over the course of our lifetimes, 1 in 3, the statistic is from 2007, so it is a bit old. What we're expecting when we see new statistics released is that it'll be 1 in 4 and then 1 in 2. Wow. So this really does affect everyone. And despite the fact that we say 1 in 2 over the course of our lifetimes, well, 100% of us are coping. Right? Life is stressful. Work is stressful. And so 100% of us have to develop coping skills in order to deal with that stress. So this affects everyone. 30% of all disability claims, and this is on the low end of those reported figures from insurers, are a direct result of mental illness, so they're filed because of things like chronic stress or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. But despite the fact it's only 30% of claims, it's 70% of all disability-associated costs, and those are primary costs. So we're not even addressing right now the secondary or tertiary costs that emerge when we speak with insurers or speak with workplaces.
You know, these numbers are staggering, and it's amazing to hear. This is something that we definitely need to pay attention to. So although the stats are a little bit outdated, like when I see on this slide 500,000 miss work every week, 30% of disability claims, 70% of costs, and that last bullet point of $51 billion annually. Lawrence, with your experience, your expertise, and you've been in this space for a while, what can leaders do in this space to assist with these numbers, hopefully getting better?
Yeah, so what I would say leaders can do is certainly think about those, what I like to call those tactics, techniques, and procedures that you use when you interact with other staff. Certainly think about what you can do in order to ensure that people feel safe coming forward. My mantra is that a good leader is a vulnerable leader. A good leader is someone that's prepared and equipped to be able to say, you know what, I've experienced concerns in the past as well. Not to say that I understand what's happening, but to say that I understand that this is difficult, that this takes courage to come forward and tell me about this. So let's find solutions together. I'm not going to solve the problem for you, but I'm going to help you navigate the process. And that's where leadership comes in. It's not about solving the problem. It's about helping and assisting the person navigate the process of either receiving an accommodation, going on a return to work plan, or maybe just having a talk, because that's all that's needed. You
know, it's interesting. You mentioned the point of not solving the problem.
Yeah.
With your experience, do you think there is a mindset with leaders that go into this that it's like, I just here's a problem and I want to solve it, just because that's what they're kind of used to in their workforce?
Yeah, certainly. And, you know, and I think a lot of us relate to this. I think many leaders in the workplace would characterize themselves as being type A.
Right.
This tendency to attack problems, right, to be assertive in our or solutions focused. My partner all the time, when I go home at the end of the day, will say, you know, I had something happen at work or something's going on in my life, and my immediate reaction is to go, okay, this is going to be a three-phase operation. Phase 1, we're going to do this. Phase 2, Phase 3.
So I'm curious, and your partner's receptive to this type of?
Not at all. The first thing they tell me is that, you know what, I just wanted to talk to you. I didn't want you to solve my problem.
Right.
I wanted to talk to you. And I think we need to understand that as leaders, sometimes we don't have the tools to solve the problem because at the end of the day, we're not clinicians. If I'm writing someone a script at work because they're presenting with a mental health concern, that doesn't make me a doctor, that makes me a drug dealer.
Right.
And I think we need to be cognizant of that, right? We're not clinicians.
Good. Excellent.
So really the first things that we can do as leaders is make sure that we engage people in those solutions. When we think of mental health, what we're really talking about is a state of well-being in which an individual can realize their abilities, cope with the normal stresses of life. I talked about that. 100% of us are coping. And then work productively and fruitfully. And when I say work productively and fruitfully, what I'm not talking about is what you do for work. We do this really bizarre thing in Western society where if you invite me to your house for dinner, Sonny, and I'm hoping you do because I heard about your barbecuing skills earlier.
You did there.
I'm gonna introduce myself to your friends and to your family and tell them my name and also what I do for work. And that's kind of bizarre when you think about it because I'm telling you what I did to make money this week. Right? Does that say anything about me as an individual or me as a person? So when we say work productively and fruitfully, what we're really talking about is vocation, right? This ability for us to connect to something that we do that enables self-actualization. It's very rare to encounter that in our work. Sometimes we identify as the profession, right? So we identify as lawyers, as doctors, as soldiers, as medical professionals, as retailers. But for the most part, we connect to other things. I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a brother, I'm a sister, I'm a caregiver. I'm a guitarist in a band. I might write poetry. I journal. I write memoirs.
Right.
These are the things that we connect to as human beings. So it's finding ways to work productively and fruitfully in that space, not just what we do for a living.
And that's an interesting point, because if you meet someone new, and yes, I will invite you to my house for a barbecue just because you said that. The common question, to your point, is, hey, nice to meet you, Lawrence. And then the follow-up is, what do you do?
Yeah.
Right? So it's an interesting point. So I think that, yeah.
So it's, when we talk about mental health, it's beyond just working at work, right? It's about how do we self-actualize as human beings. And finally, this is something that respects culture, equity, and social justice, right? We have to understand that when we look at the modern workforce, it's much more diverse than it used to be. And so when we look at the policies that we implement in workplaces, we have to be cognizant of that. One of the things that I ask employers when I go into employers and I look at their policies and we do a review of that policy during an organizational audit is I ask them, what are you doing for reconciliation? Because we've heard a lot about that recently with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission ongoing here in Canada, and certainly the recommendations that were made for government. But that's an active process. That's something that we all have to do as Canadians, as people that live here in this country. And so it's being creative and flexible in our policy implementation and policy writing processes that assists in mental health in the workplace, assists in creating good mental health in the workplace.
And, again, the words that you're using, Lawrence, I really appreciate. Assist, not solve.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Work with, good, collaboration.
Yeah. To define mental illness, I don't think anyone here takes the DSM-5 home with them at the end of the day and reads that for some light bedtime reading.
And sorry, DSM-5
is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So kind of the Bible for clinicians that work within mental health and mental illness. Really, we look at changes in 3 areas: thinking, mood, and behavior. So when we talk about changes in thinking, we might talk about things like rumination, catastrophizing, tendency to engage in those cognitive distortions that occur in the context of depression, in the context of anxiety. When we think of changes in mood, what we're really talking about is a dysregulation of mood from what is normal for that individual. Some of us are very activated on a regular basis. Some of us might be a bit more not as activated as others.
Right.
Really what it comes down to is if you're finding yourself having more bad days than good days, over a period of 3 to 4 weeks, it's probably time to talk to someone about that. And what we notice in the workplace is really behaviors associated with mental illness or addictions. We're not noticing change in thinking because none of us are mind readers.
Right.
We can't necessarily tell how someone's feeling just based on how they're acting. I'm sure we've all experienced, laughing at something inappropriate, right? Like at a funeral, for example, or you cry at an inappropriate moment. So those aren't good indicators of necessarily how we're feeling. We're just having a kind of a bizarre emotional reaction to something. We rely on behavior in the workplace. And so what we talk about in the context of courses that we teach is certainly noticing what the baseline of your staff are like, knowing your staff first, and seeing if there's been a dramatic change in some of their behaviors or in their productivity or in how they comport themselves in the workplace. And that's the time to start having that conversation. Really important to understand that this affects all aspects of a person's life. That there's a somatic component to mental illness, so things like tension, headaches, and emetic response to anxiety, these things that we're all aware of,
right.
Those occur in the context of mental illness as well. And so we're going to see multiple interactions between our physical health and our psychological health in the context of a mental health concern.
It's interesting. A couple of times now you mentioned mental health, and then you also mentioned mental illness. Can you explain the difference?
Yeah. So really, we all have mental health, right? So mental health is something that we all have. I talked about the fact that 100% of us are coping. That's absolutely true. The other thing to understand is that we can have a mental illness, be diagnosed with a mental illness, and have wonderful mental health.
Interesting.
If I was conducting a webinar right now with perhaps a friend that had diabetes, if he's ensuring that he takes his insulin or maybe exercises and eats certain foods on a regular basis, he can still experience wonderful mental health despite the diagnosis of diabetes. So it's not that we have poor mental health because of mental illness, it's that we can find ways to cope, develop tools within our toolbox that enable us to experience wonderful mental health or to flourish, really, at the end of the day. The flip side of that is that we've all experienced periods of poor mental health without a diagnosis of mental illness. So think back to the last time you were the most stressed or despondent or something was going on in your life. It probably didn't last 3 or 4 weeks, in which case that's still poor mental health. It's not meeting that threshold for a diagnosis.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah. So the National Standard for Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace is something that we really advocate workplaces take a look at if they haven't either done this already or if they're looking for tools that they can utilize in order to improve psychological health and safety at work. Right off the bat, it was something that was developed by the CSA group and the B&Q commissioned by the Mental Health Commission of Canada and released in 2013. The interesting thing about the national standard is that while we're pretty familiar with occupational health and standards, what's really great and what I think is a wonderful component of it is it talks not only about prevention but also promotion. And part of that promotion piece is the psychological health and safety management system found within the standard. So it's really about how do managers interact with staff and how do they engage with policy in a way that is human-focused. Because when we think about policy, we often think about, okay, this is something that we must do. We don't think about the human element to policy. And so what the standard forces us to do as managers and leaders is to look at that human element. Psychological health and safety writ large is really something that identifies, manages, and eliminates hazards and risks of psychological harm. A hazard or risk of psychological harm can really be anything for any individual. Common things that we see in the workplace are obviously things like commute times. I mean, here in Toronto, the Eglinton Crosstown is definitely causing issues in regards to that. But also things like just the temperature of the office, where the office is located, noise levels, a switch maybe from a more individual work environment to a more open work environment. Flex work hours or the inability to access flex work hours, sick time. So these things can all be hazards and risks, but also strengths.
So let's pause there for a moment. Can it get to a point where an employer says, how much more can I do? Is this undue hardship? And I have a business that I need to run, and obviously these are great accommodation pieces, but they do cost money. Well, what would you say to someone that would make a comment like that?
Yeah, so I would say that, first of all, I mean, we'll discuss this when we discuss accommodations, that the average accommodation cost is quite low for a mental health concern, under $500 over the course of the employee's tenure. I really encourage people to take or keep an eye out. Deloitte's going to be releasing a study in the very near future telling us that for every dollar spent on focusing and promoting mental health in the workplace, organizations are seeing $4 on a return on that investment.
Wow.
So it is something when we promote, we're spending a bit of money up front, and it looks like it's a cost. It's not going to generate revenue, but at the end of the day, it does. The first thing I ask any organization when I'm talking to their HR department is, how much does it cost to hire someone? And there's a cost associated with that.
Right,
and then
training and benefits and going, that totally makes sense.
And then after that, I ask, well, when do they start becoming profitable? When do they start making you money? Because I'm going to guarantee you it's not at the end of their training, right? They're still on the job training that's going to occur.
And what kind of response do you get?
Right, and they usually give me some form of number. And so then I ask, well, what's your turnover rate? And if the turnover rate is only after a year, after 2 years, well, are you really capitalizing on that investment you've made into that employee? And moreover, I'm hoping that organizations are picking the best person for the job. It's not like you're covering your eyes and just picking someone out of that resume stack, right, and hoping for the best.
Right.
You've hired who you think is the best person for that job. And so you want to keep them there and capitalize on that investment you've made in that individual. And so by not paying attention to this, we do end up seeing turnover. We do end up seeing things like absenteeism or a loss in productivity. And so what we're doing is really enabling the self-actualization of professionals. And so that's how we need to look at this. It's not about problematizing the issue. It's about self-actualization and ensuring that people can be the best they can be at work.
I know with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that's a big component with self-actualization. And yes, I did throw in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Learned that in school, by the way. But no, it's a great point. I don't want to spend too much time on it because I know that you will be talking about stats later on. You mentioned the HR professionals that you speak to, and I can tell you that on our webinars, including this one, we do have HR professionals on there. The comment of accommodation not being that expensive, there still is a trepidation and a hesitance and a resistance out there. Maybe not resistance, but more so trepidation and a hesitance of, we are an equal opportunity employer. We respect everyone. But if this person I have to accommodate, is there a liability or risk for me? And some people, not saying our members, I'm just saying in general, may not hire that person. And again, I'm being very careful here because obviously this whole purpose of this webinar is to encourage that, of having that risk there. What would your comment be to that?
I would say that I understand that and I empathize with that, right? So I think, but the important thing to understand is that this affects all of us. At some point in time, half of us are going to be diagnosed with a mental health concern. A quarter of us in this year at some point in time are going to be diagnosed or meet that threshold for diagnosis. So we're already working with individuals who experience mental illness, who experience addictions concerns, and we continue to work with them. So this isn't something where we are looking to avoid a certain subset of the population or potentially prevent it from occurring, because it is going to occur. Right. The important thing to understand is that by accommodating people, we're ensuring their success in the workplace. It's not about giving people a favor. It's about ensuring success in the workplace and success for the business at the end of the day. Right. So I think I empathize with that, with maybe that mindset or maybe that reluctance or reticence. Right. But I think it's misfounded or unfounded.
Good.
So when we talk about areas of psychosocial risk, the first thing, or the one that I think is most important of those 13 factors, is organizational culture. And this is really the degree to which a workplace is characterized by trust, honesty, and fairness. I always tell workplaces, because I'll throw this slide up and they look at me with a raised eyebrow, and I tell them right off the bat that, this isn't about me throwing on my Birkenstock, sitting around a campfire with you and singing Kumbaya. I've never owned a pair of Birkenstocks, and I'm not a great singer. So this isn't about being, kind of hippie and kind of touchy-feely or anything like that. These are things that we can measure quantitatively and qualitatively, right? Things that actually have a dollar value associated with it. And so these basic assumptions that we make about a workplace in regards to its organizational culture really can't predict positive and productive social processes. At the end of the day, the workplace is a learning organization. The better we get at this, and the more attention we pay to our culture, the better we get at making money. We learn how to be more efficient. We learn how to do things better. We learn how to be more productive. It's not just about making sure the workplace is safe. It's also about making sure the workplace is as effective as it possibly can be to the end goals of the organization. And then also when we think about organizational culture, what this really comes down to is, well, what's your strategic vision? That is derived from culture, right? At the end of the day, you can have a great strategic vision, but if the culture doesn't support that, well, you're not going to meet that vision. So when we think about culture, this is where, or when we think about vision, this is where we need to start. We need to start at culture. We need to think about how do we interact with one another, and how do we ensure that this is a productive process, that the ecosystem that's formed by people is one that is supportive.
You mentioned training in there. So culture, I love the example that you use. It's not fluffy, kumbaya, around a fire, because some could be perceived that as, okay, what do you mean by culture? I agree with the comments that you meant. But so how does one train that culture? And let me give you a little bit more context. Many of our employers on the call today, they have new hire orientations, right? Worker comes in. I'll just use myself here as an example. So myself being Sunny, I come in and they're giving me training. Absenteeism policy, send policy. I need your void check, by the way. And all these policies they're signing off and da-da-da-da. So they're doing all this training. Should culture be trained right off the bat? And if it's not right off the bat, that vision that you talked about, should that culture be trained to supervisors? How does one get the culture across?
I think that's a great point. And what I would say is that when we think about staff training or that onboarding process, a few things that can be done immediately are things like ensuring that when you talk about accommodations, when you talk about return to work, be explicit that this is inclusive of mental illness or a mental health concern, right? So we often think accommodation, well, I've injured my back, I need an ergonomic chair now, right? We tend not to think about it like, if I'm having a bad day, I need something for that. The next is when we talk about management or we talk about managers, one of the things that we want to ensure is happening is that when managers, and a lot of organizations I want to say are already doing this, so we train to things like coaching for excellence. We train to things like maybe emotional intelligence, and then certainly mental health awareness. So incorporating that into our training system and ensuring that managers are getting trained in order to pay attention to this issue and to be more empathetic, we're doing good work, and we're helping to build a culture that is more open. A culture that's open is a culture that's going to be able to grow. A culture that's closed off, a culture that doesn't talk about these issues, is one that probably after 20 years we're going to see either the failure of the organization or the organization recognize that the culture needs to change or to shift.
I know we do have some time. We're doing really good, so I do want to touch on this a little bit, but just a little bit more. You visit workplaces all the time. You mentioned earlier on that you assess and you give advice and you go through policies and procedures and et cetera. With your expertise, are you able to assess the culture, like your first 5, 10, 15 minutes that you're in? Or is that even a part of the thing that you do?
Yeah, so I'd say that when we talk about culture, this is something that is really composed of multiple areas of psychosocial risk. The national standard lays out kind of those 13, and then the 14th, right, being whatever the organization determines is necessary or is an area of risk. But things that we might look for, things that might be conducted in an audit, are your policies representative of everyone in the workforce, right? Are we seeing things like bullying or harassment? But when looking at union grievances, are those union grievances made up of a particular type of grievance, right? So is it issues related to harassment or issues related to abuse in the workplace? Are we inclusive in the language that we use, right? Are we ensuring that our interactions with one another are made up of civility and respect? And we'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But culture is something that is felt. It's also something that we can identify through certain types of analysis.
Excellent. No, it's great. Great to hear your insights on that.
Yeah, so really, I think we're all pretty familiar with this idea of civility and respect, right? Or at least we should be. And this is the idea that a work environment is a place where employees feel that they're being respected, that they feel heard, and that they're considerate in their interactions with one another. Really showing esteem, care, consideration, and acknowledging the dignity of each individual staff member, regardless of the role that they have in the workplace. A simple way of ensuring this as a manager is just saying hello in the morning, right? Taking the time and the effort to do that, that goes a long way. Ensuring that when you make promises, you follow through on promises, right? So if you say to your staff that, hey, I've got an open door policy, make sure the door's actually open sometimes, or make sure they have time that they can come and talk to you. When we talk about things like the perception of fairness or the perception of trust in the workplace, this means ensuring that there's no favoritism in the workplace. It means ensuring that when we're interacting with staff members from different backgrounds, from different cultures, that we're cognizant of that background, that we're cognizant of that culture, and if we're recognizing that this is an issue in the workplace, training to ensure success. So maybe it means bringing in people to conduct cultural awareness training. Maybe it means having something incorporated into our onboarding process or incorporated into our management training that ensures that people are aware of some of the issues that might arise in regards to civility and respect in the workplace.
Interesting. So, again, the training piece, which I'm touching on, and to our listeners today, really hope that you're picking up on that, especially for the HR professionals that contribute to the training in their workplaces of having the items that you had mentioned with civility and respect.
I'm a big believer in the fact that there's no one on this planet that rises to the level of the occasion. Not a single person. But all of us can sink to the level of training that we've received, right? So training is a baseline. And in moments of stress and moments of hardship, that's what we sink to. We don't come up with new and innovative ideas when we're stressed or when the organization is stressed. We sink to that training and that policy that we have in order to ensure success. So train to it.
Love it. It's funny, even around this room, we're all nodding our heads. And my apologies, I didn't introduce our colleague early on the call, Michelle Rubo, who's our Director of Events, who's assisting me today. And she's shaking her head, thinks, Sonny, you don't need to introduce me, but I still introduce you anyways. All right, so moving on. So accommodation, tell me.
Yeah, so really, this is basic. And so we kind of have an archipelago of regulations across the country. Here in Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the Accessible Employment Standard. But we're going to see similar standards across the country. And really, it's this idea that everyone has the right to equal treatment in employment, regardless of disability or differing ability, that we can't be discriminated against based on that actual disability or the perception of disability, right? So this is important. Oftentimes, when it comes to mental illness or addictions, we have some presuppositions about an individual who might experience something like depression or anxiety. Oh, maybe we shouldn't be putting too much stress on them. Maybe they can't be in a position of leadership or responsibility because that'll overwhelm them. That's not the case. We're perceiving that there's a disability there when there might not be one. It's important to note that we have a duty to accommodate up to the point of undue hardship, right? I don't want to belabor that point because I think most of us are going to be pretty familiar with that idea of undue hardship. But really it's this idea that a reasonable accommodation is often something that is not expensive and often something that is arrived at relatively quickly as long as we've had a proper occupational assessment done and there's an understanding of what some of those functional impairments might be in the workplace.
Excellent.
The two things I want to make sure that everyone understands is that we're not entitled to a diagnosis, so that unless the employee discloses to you, you won't know if this is depression or anxiety, right? You'll just know some of those maybe cognitive impairments or functional impairments that are present in the workplace, and also that there is no list that I can give you for accommodation. Right? There's not a panacea that I can provide or that anyone can really provide. That one individual with depression will receive a very different accommodation than another individual. Right? We don't accommodate illness. We accommodate a symptom of the illness. So that list is going to be very varied, and quite frankly, people have to be flexible in order to ensure they accommodate effectively.
Right, and I like that comment of you are not entitled to a diagnosis, right? So that's interesting. So you talked about accommodation, again, a lot of great insights. So tell me, let's get into the return to work piece.
Yeah, so with the return to work, really I want to make sure that people view this as an accommodation, right? That sometimes the best thing for an employee is going to be some time off in order to get well. It's really important that during the return to work process, we maintain a bit of contact, and that could look like many things. It could be a phone call once every few months. It could be just an email exchange. Maybe it's a sit-down meeting somewhere that's neutral, not forcing the employee to meet, but maybe that's what they want to do. And the reason you want to do that is because maybe they need more time, or maybe they want to come back earlier because some things have been resolved. Before, if at all possible, they go on the leave of absence, make sure you provide them with what the core functions of their job are. So almost think back to the job fact sheet that they would have applied to for that position at the organization.
So the physical demands, everything,
Exactly.
limitations, restrictions. Yeah.
Exactly, and the reason you want to do that is because that is a roadmap to success. They're then able to take that to whoever their occupational therapist is, potentially their psychologist or the clinician that's responsible for their clinical care, and look at that list and say, okay, what do I need to work on in order to go back to work, right? What are those baseline things that I need to be able to do or be able to handle so that I can go back to work and really flourish at work? And so that's really critical to their success. Make sure you provide them with that. And then finally, just make sure you're planning the return, right? So ask some questions. We've listed a few there, but that, again, is not an exhaustive list.
Before we move on to the legal case, you mentioned about contacting the worker. Now, I understand that, yes, if a person's off, let's just say an occupational injury, they had a slip and fall at work, they're off for a couple of months, generally the supervisor will call and say, hey, just checking in on you, how are you doing? But what I'm hearing from you is that that's just as important, no matter what they're off on, mental health or whatever issue they be, and of course respecting the fact that they don't need to disclose that to the employer, bringing a doctor's note, saying due to medical reasons, it does suffice, and nor do you need to disclose that with your employer. I guess I would think that people listening on this call today may feel, well, if this person's off for medical reasons and they're off for 2-3 months, I don't want to bother them. I want to let them be, and I don't want them to be, oh my God, now my boss is calling me. Are you serious? I'm supposed to be healing right now, and now you're calling me. So it's I respect your point. I'm not disagreeing with you. But I wouldn't be doing my job right now if I didn't ask that. I can definitely see some people not wanting to contact.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's important to look at what are those procedures that the employee wants to see, right? Yeah. So ask them the question, hey, I'm going to give you a call in 2 or 3 months, just do a check-in because this is a 6-month leave.
Right.
Is that okay if we do a call? Or would you prefer an email, right? Or, hey, if you don't want to maintain contact, here's my email. Make sure that you're emailing us if you're going to come back early or want to come back early, or if there's another question. So it's being open and asking those questions up front as early as possible during the leave process to ensure that you do get that information, because you're absolutely right. The thing that I would consider about that, though, is that we have a tendency to treat people that come back from a physical injury or illness a certain way, and then people that come back from potentially a mental health leave another way. So really think about how do you welcome people back into the office. If you have a cake and some cupcakes and maybe a little get-together in the boardroom when they come back because they've been off for maybe a broken leg, then make sure you do that for all employees who are coming back, right?
And we spoke about this before the call started, and you're right. I know we've heard this examples actually from your organization who's been at our HR events where they have, that was the exact example. Woman got hurt at work, got hurt and got in a car accident, was off for 3 months. Everybody was checking up on her. She came back. There was balloons, cake, they did a celebration. A year later, the same person went off for medical reasons, and there was this, oh yeah, right, medical reasons, and there was a whole different approach, and she didn't get no balloons, no nothing when she came back. So what we're hearing from you is make sure if you do practice that it's equal across the board.
Yeah, and that comes back to that conversation about culture, right? Trust, honesty, and fairness.
Right. Fairness being the key piece there. Excellent. Moving on.
So really, I think most of us are going to be familiar with the idea that we do have a legal responsibility here. What I want to highlight is that in some provinces, in fact in many provinces, a manager is not only expected to understand the effects that their behavior are going to have on staff members, but also they can be held personally liable for the infliction of mental suffering. So we need to make sure that, again, coming back to this training piece, that our managers are being trained effectively, regardless of the level they're at, whether they're in the C-suite or down on the factory floor, that they're being trained effectively to be able to have these interactions in order to protect themselves and protect the organization, and then finally, to protect the staff member. So training to this, and making sure that this is understood across the organization is vital.
Excellent. And the due diligence, of course.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Excellent. So let's move on. I think you have an example of the human rights case that you'd like to share?
Yeah, so really, and this is a pretty simple and broad example, is that we still discriminate against people with something as simple as depression, right? So there's probably language that we've all heard about people that might experience depressive symptoms, things like, oh, they're being lazy, or oh, they just don't want to come into work, or oh, you know, they're getting special treatment. Things like that really do a lot of harm. When we talk about depression in that way, that does a lot of harm. And so what we're seeing is an increasing recognition of this at the tribunal level. I think one of the emerging trends, certainly within Canada, that we're seeing, and here in Ontario especially, is that to take someone to the tribunal is a very low barrier. It doesn't take a lot of effort. You don't have to hire a lawyer. You can go online and access the tribunal services, right, and representation at the tribunal through an online process. So to be cognizant of the fact that how we treat individuals in the workplace might have severe repercussions for us from a risk perspective is important, right? And so by implementing something like the national standard or ensuring that your accommodation practices are good, right, and up to snuff, really does ensure that we're not being taken to court, not being taken to the tribunal, and also ensures that our staff are protected, right? And at the end of the day, that's what I care about, but as an organization, you should also care about your ability to sustain yourself over the long term,
right.
Which means not opening yourself up to a human rights violation.
Yeah, and not to say that's what employers want to do. Of course, they want to accommodate and et cetera, but what you're saying here is, listen, it's important that you follow these policies and procedures and what you've been saying this whole webinar, and because there's also a repercussion if you do not, and possibly some fees and fines that can be imposed if you don't accommodate that worker as you are supposed to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the emerging trends that we're seeing is actually a lack of reticence on behalf of the tribunal to, you know, if someone takes an employer to the tribunal or a prospective employer that didn't bring them onto staff, and the tribunal will actually order that person to be employed, and can produce that order for the organization. So again, going back to I think that comment earlier about, oh, well, you know, I don't want to bring on someone that I'm going to have to immediately accommodate. That's I've talked about a lot of carrots here. I think there's a big stick.
There's a big stick there? Excellent. Yeah. Well, listen, I know we can talk about this for hours. Just given the time, let's definitely move on to the business case. And we definitely want to go and ask some questions from our members that, and I see some typing away that we will definitely ask you at the end.
Yeah, so I would say that the business case, I mean, we can talk about return on investment, and I mentioned that that Deloitte report. I think it's actually already being released. I just saw that, so that's good news.
Good.
What I would say is that at the end of the day, the business case, you will see a return on investment. But by paying attention to this, and I can't belabor this point enough, by paying attention to this, you will save a life. And I think as managers, especially in many circles, that's a powerful thing. This idea that just by paying attention to this, by treating people fairly, by ensuring that we're psychologically healthy in our interactions with one another, a life is going to be saved. You might not know when, you might not know who, you might not know how, but you can understand that it is being saved. And if you walk away from today's webinar, it's only 45 minutes, walk away with that.
Wow, that's powerful. That's powerful. So moving on, I know you've touched a little bit on this with benefits. Is there anything else that you wanted to reiterate on this piece, or should we open it now for some questions?
So I think I'm comfortable leaving the slide up because those benefits, you know, we spoke to most of those just in the context of our conversation. So I'm happy to open up to any questions if there are direct questions about particular issues or particular concerns.
Sure. All right. So from our first member today, the question reads as follows, and the question is for you, Lawrence, is that you've been in this industry for a long time. You've definitely done some great work with you and your organization. Are we progressing?
So I would say we are, right? And the important thing to note about the national standard is that we talk about it in the context of it being an iterative process, right? It's not linear. It's not like you can say, okay, on D-21, we're going to start the implementation process, and then on D-Day, we're done implementing, right? We've hit the standard. No, it's an iterative process, right? Because workplaces change, so the process is going to change. We have to constantly be engaged in it, right? And we take the same approach to safety. So I would say we've seen some really great strides in this regard. We've seen organizations take a look at their benefits provision and the provision of things like EAP, and then expand that and say, you know what, people can access other services or other funds in order to ensure that. So I would say that, yes, we're making a lot of progress, but we still have work to do.
Well, that's a great, that's good to hear, definitely from hearing from a member's perspective and yours that we are going up the hill. We're not on top of the hill is what I'm hearing, but we're going up the hill. So I'm going to ask the question that we also got from a member. Again, we don't disclose our members, who the member is, but we do disclose the question itself. So the question is as follows. Is there guidance on how to approach an employee to discuss a possible mental health concern? There is a noted drop in performance and mood. How do we dialogue that and try to assist them without risking liability, et cetera?
Yeah, so what I would say is the first thing to do is start a conversation, right? So you've noticed the change, and now you've been presented with a problem that or that challenge that we talked about before, right? Is this a performance issue, or is this a resultant of a mental health concern? Now it's time to start the conversation. And starting the conversation really means sitting down with the member, sitting down with the employee, and asking, what's going on, right? We've noticed a change. Do you want to talk about that change? Do you have any idea of why that change might be occurring? If you're already aware that there is a mental health concern, then maybe it's time to take a look at, are the accommodations that are being provided actually supportive of you, or maybe are they working to your detriment, or are they having a deleterious effect on the person's health? Maybe the accommodations aren't needed anymore, and that's resulting in a drop in performance. What I would say is that a mental illness or a substance use concern is never an excuse for bad behavior in the workplace, or never an excuse for necessarily poor performance, but it can be a mitigating factor in how we address poor performance or how we address not hitting certain types of deliverables. So start the conversation and then ask the person what they might need, right? If they're not sure, then this is when we start to talk about things like, maybe providing an occupational assessment for the individual, which is the workplace's responsibility. It's important to note that. We have a tendency to think that when someone goes into a doctor, the doctor is going to understand what the occupational issues are, but there's a high chance they won't, right? So it's important for the organization to maybe bring in that occupational specialist in order to assess what's going on. What I would say is that when we talk about things like a drop in performance, just be honest, right? And be open to the fact that this person is going to be very vulnerable at this point, that you're making the environment safe for them, right? So there's basic things like make sure they don't have their back up against the wall, make sure they can see the door if you're having a conversation in their office. Adopt an empathic approach. Use I statements, not you statements. Don't accuse the person of having depression, right? Leave it open-ended so the person can leave the conversation if they have to, because this is a pretty distressing time or moment in their career.
Right. And it was interesting the way you were speaking right there. Those aren't attacking questions, and you were very careful how you positioned that. I am noticing a decline in your work. Is everything okay? How can I help? Because like you said, you don't want to be implying and assuming, but really careful on how you're wording that question. Yeah. But you also said to be honest. So I think where this member is going is, and I think we got a thank you, perfect, from the member, so you answered their question, can I? Am I able to ask?
I would say that it's your responsibility as a leader or as a manager to ask those questions, right? I always say there's a difference between management and leadership. Managers look up, right? Managers look up to what the boss needs, to what the CEO needs, and they achieve that goal. Leaders look up, but they also look down, right? So there is a difference between leadership and management. A leader is someone that's looking up and, achieving the mission, but they're also taking care of the people that report to them.
I will definitely be using that in my career, and I will be taking full credit that I made that. No, I'm joking. Thank you for that. Listen, Lawrence, this has been great information and great insights. You can clearly tell the way you speak that you're passionate, you're expert in this field. Let me ask you one final question before we wrap up. And for everyone on the call, if you do have questions for Lawrence or RCC, you do have the information that you can be contacted at, so feel free to reach to RCC. We can provide you with those details. Again, it is available on the deck. Lawrence, my final question for you. What's your final thoughts? If you can leave one message for our members today, what would that message be?
Yeah, I would say that my final thought is really, and I'm going to put this out here and challenge everyone on the call today, I despise the term work-life balance. I hate it. And the reason I despise that is because I think it gives us an idea that if we're really rocking it in the workplace, right, we're succeeding, we're getting paid more, we're being promoted, that obviously our home life is suffering, right? Or the flip side of that is that, if we're a great parent, if we're a great friend, if we're a great brother, sister, son, daughter, then obviously we're not focusing at work, right? Maybe we're just going to tread water for a little while. I don't think that's true. Right? And what I really think we need to start doing and what we need to be cognizant of is that in the workplace, we need to enable employees to bring their whole selves to work. Bring every facet of their being into the workplace and allow them to be authentic. And then more importantly, right, and this certainly comes to when we talk about prevention or talk about risk, is that ensure that when they go home at the end of the day and go back to their wife or go back to their husband or go back to their family, they're bringing their whole selves back home with them.
Wow.
And that's what I'm going to leave.
Great. Well, those are some great final thoughts. Again, on behalf of Retail Council of Canada and our members, thank you so much for joining us today. For everyone on the call, just want to let you know, as mentioned earlier, that this webinar is available in webinar audio. So feel free to definitely listen to that. Also, again, feel free to go to our website. It is available on RCC's website. You will see a list of webinars, so feel free to listen to that. And lastly, as I mentioned earlier before we wrap up, please do join us for our last webinar, which is coming up on November 12th, A Healthy Store, Workplace Accommodations and Resources for Mental Health. Well, everyone, we want to thank you again, and that wraps up today's session. Wishing everyone a safe day.